So I'm gonna switch my camera off during the presentation, I think, and then I'll put it back on at the end when we do the questions. So first of all, thank you very much to Ben. Really, really useful and answered, as Hilary said, a lot of questions there. My name is Chris Newson. I'm the head of learning at Make UK, specifically in the health and safety division of our company. And I'm going to talk for the next 25, 30 minutes or so, specifically about how what Ben has explained applies to machinery. So I'm only talking about machinery, and I will answer questions at the end specifically on machinery only, because that's my area of expertise, if that's okay with everyone. So that's me, that's what I'm going to be covering. So the regulation that we're talking about here is has not changed at all because of the Brexit process, for want of a better phrase. The regulation we're talking about is the Supply of Machinery Safety Regulations 2008. That was what it was called before. That's what it is called now, and it will be continued to be called that. A couple of key things on what that regulation says. So first of all, it defines machinery. So it tells us what machinery is. Why is that important? Well, you know, very clearly, hopefully, if your product is not machinery, then you need to look at another regulation here. So machinery is defined as two or more moving parts that are linked together to do an application or complete an application, and there is a power source. So very important, there's a power source. That's the definition of machinery. If your product doesn't fit that definition, it's probably not in machinery. There's a couple of caveats there, but it's probably not in this regulation. So once we've assessed that, and worked out whether this is the regulation for us, what does it say? Well, it tells us that, as Ben alluded to, we have to meet certain essential health and safety requirements. So it says, you know, don't let your machine hurt people, basically. That, again, hasn't changed at all. That is exactly the same as it was before. So that's that. So in other words, if you complied before, you will comply now. The regulation also outlines conformity procedures. So it gives you three different sorts of routes you can go through to CE mark previously your machinery. So I'll explain those in detail in a few minutes. It also does things like require a technical file to be produced. It requires you to produce a certificate of conformity, and previously it required you to put a CE mark on, but now it requires you to put a UKCA mark on. So that's the regulation. As you can see, you know, it's more or less the same as it was before. So that's the purpose of the regulation, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in detail. It really helps me if I can understand who's on the call today to try and put the emphasis in the right place. So we've got our first poll here. So I'm going to pass over to Aaron. He's put the choices up on the screen. So we'd just like you to know whether you are a supplier of machinery, a user of machinery, or actually you both supply and use machinery. So we'll give you a couple of minutes just to answer that. How are we looking, Aaron? Are we getting a lot of answers in?
We're just past 70%, so not a bad turnout so far. But if you want to give it another 20 seconds or so, just to let everyone else.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, we've got some answers.
That's perfect.
Okay, so what sort of percentages did we get?
So as a supplier of machinery, we were sitting at 30%, a user only at 46%, and then 24% selected the both.
Okay, Aaron, thank you. So yeah, that's a good spread. Most people are users, but pretty close with suppliers, and we've got some people that are both. The only reason I asked that question, as I say, is to get a sense of who's there, so we can put emphasis in the right place. You know, it's sort of more or less 50-50, so we'll cover both. What I would say about this is that if you are a supplier, you obviously need to really understand the regulations because you're supplying machinery. That's, you know, sensible. But if you're only a user, so 46% of people have said they're just a user, if you see what I mean, they don't supply. Really important with this directive in particular and this regulation that you understand the methods that suppliers have to go through, because they're very different and they do put a different feel on the machinery that you're receiving. That'll become clear as I go through. So thank you for that, and thanks for getting the results together, Aaron. So what we're talking about here, really, what people generally refer to, I think, is this change is going from CE mark to UKCA. But of course, it's much more than that. So the details of the actual changes, now again, and I hopefully won't repeat this again, different to what Ben was talking about, I'm talking specifically about machinery here. So nothing else at all, just machinery, given that definition that I mentioned earlier on. So from the 1st of January this year, UKCA marking began, as we all know, I think, to replace CE marking onto the GB market. Ben already talked about the NI, and basically, as he explained very well, with NI, it's basically as it was with CE marking. So 1st of January into GB, we now have to use UKCA, or sorry, UKCA begins to replace CE. The essential requirements for machinery are largely the same. In fact, they're exactly the same with machinery. The difference is that in order to show you comply with those requirements, before you used EU harmonized standards, and now you can only use GB designated standards. And again, as Ben said, they are largely the same. So we'll go through that a little bit later on. The idea of either EU harmonized standards or GB designated standards is to help you interpret the requirements and the regulations. The regulations talk about essential requirements. The standards are there to help you understand them. The UKCA mark will not be recognised in the EU. So Ben talked about that already. You know, if you're dual marking, you're putting that on with CE, no problem. But UKCA on its own isn't recognised. The reason for that is because it only shows compliance with UK law, the 2008 regulation I mentioned earlier on. There are, in terms of machinery, again specifically, you may be able to continue to use CE marking until the end of this year, but on the other hand, you might not, and that, I know that sounds a bit vague. I will clarify exactly when you can and can't do that. It's more arduous with machinery, I would say, about when you can, but I'll give you a clear answer on that. And as already has been mentioned as well, up until the 1st of January 2023, you can show conformance with a certificate only, and not hard stamping or affixing onto the product. After that date, you have to indelibly fix, is what the regulations say, the UKCA mark at that time. And Ben answered some questions about whether the product is too small and then you can put it on packaging. You need to refer to your specific regulation. That's not often the case with machinery, you know, that it's too small, but I suppose it could be. So those are the highlights, if you like. Those are the changes. Now, I think it's really important, if we're talking about machinery, that we actually understand the regulation itself to then know what's changed. So what you can see on the screen here is the existing EU conformance process. And I'm just going to take you through this relatively quickly, and then we'll go on to the new UKCA process. So this is from the supply of machinery regulations. So the first question for us to answer is my product machinery? So I've already mentioned the definition. The definition is crystal clear in the regulation itself. So that's the first question you need to answer. Irrespective of anything else, when you've decided if it is machinery, you then must produce a technical file and instructions. That hasn't changed, and it's not going to change. People often get quite concerned about what a technical file is. You know, it sounds a bit arduous. It can be, depending on the complexity of the machine, it can be a 1 or 2 page document that just specifies, you know, how you prove that that is actually safe. So that's a technical file. More complicated, the bigger that is. And instructions, we know what they are. So you must produce those for machinery that you produce, whether it's in GB, NI, or the EU. There is then a question: is your machinery mentioned in Annex 4 of the regulation? Now, I'm not going to go through Annex 4 today, but Annex 4 is a list of, I suppose, higher risk bits of machinery that therefore require more than just you saying it's okay. So if it's in Annex 4, it's seen as higher risk. If it's not in Annex 4, it's lower risk. Very easy to check in the regulation, Annex 4, there's a list of machines, types of machines. If it's on there, it's in Annex 4. If it's not, it's not. Now, this is why that's important. If your machinery is not in Annex 4, if we go down here, then you can use something that the regulations refer to as method 1 to show conformity. So method 1 is when you do some internal checks on manufacture. You have a technical file, there's a risk assessment in there that you did when the machine was designed and made, and you're saying it's safe. You don't have to do anything else. You say that it's safe. And then we come down here to when you make a declaration of conformity. If you're supplying into the EU, that still is an EC declaration of conformity. Once you've done that, you can CE mark and sell your product. Okay, so it's very straightforward if it's not in Annex 4. If it is in Annex 4, we're over to this part of the diagram. Now I've got 2 choices here. I can make it, remember we're talking about CE marking here, I can make it fully in line with harmonized standards. So you've seen these standards before, they're called BS something or ISO something or EU something, EN something. They are harmonized standards. If I make my product in line completely with those harmonized standards, then I can still go through method 1 if I want. So irrespective of the machine, as long as I apply standards, I can always go through method 1, which means only I need to check it. So that's important. If I do that and I want to use a different method, I can use this one here, method 2. So previously I would get an EU body to check it for me and put the mark on, or sorry, give me a certificate and then I put the mark on, or a nominated body can come in and audit my organisation and give me the ability to CE mark. So if just recap that, if I make machinery that's in Annex 4 and I do it in line with standards, I can choose either one of these 2 options, or I can even use method 1 if I want to. Final thing, if I, again, my machine is in Annex 4 and for some reason I don't want to make it in line with harmonized standards, very difficult to see why that would be, other than maybe there aren't any that cover your product. I think that's very unlikely these days, but if you choose not to make it in line with harmonized standards, okay. Method 2, so getting an external body to do it for you, and method 3, getting an external body to validate your company, are still open to you, but method 1 is not. Okay, so that hasn't changed. That is all the same. Hopefully that's clear. Usually takes us a lot longer to go through that in the classrooms, but hopefully that's clear. So that is the EU process. So, okay, here's the important thing. What's changed? So we don't, if we're talking now about UKCA marking, we can't use EU harmonized standards anymore. So those 2 boxes have got to change. And we're not really when the purpose of UKCA marking is not an EC declaration of conformity and a CE mark. We know that. So those two bits have got to change as well. Okay, so this is what they look like. And all we've done is take that previous diagram and change some of the words to show how to interpret the regulations. So what we're looking at here is all the same, as you can see, but rather than, when you come into these two boxes here, rather than using EU harmonized standards, you now have to use what are called GB designated standards. So Ben referred to these when he was talking through. So with machinery, you have to use GB designated standards to show that you've met these essential health and safety requirements. So it's all the same. Instead of harmonized standards, it now says GB standards. So just make sure you're using GB designated standards. And then when we come to the end, we're now interested in not the CE mark, but the UKCA mark. Okay. But I think it's really important. Let's just remember this, that if we're making machinery and it's not in Annex 4, then we can still use method 1, which means only the company that's producing it needs to do the declaration of conformity and needs to put the UKCA mark on. We don't need to involve anyone else. Okay, so that's important if your machinery is not in Annex 4. Even if it is in Annex 4 and we apply all these GB designated standards, we can still go through method 1. So it's really important, as you will know, of course, to look at what you do today and what changes you need to make to meet the new requirement. So, and that is, if you went through method 1 before, you can still go through method 1 and you don't need to involve anyone else. And rather than putting a CE mark on, you use a UKCA mark. Okay, so that's the UKCA process. And I've got another hopefully helpful flowchart for you shortly. A couple of other things to say. Again, this is all helpful stuff. So on the 6th of January this year, BAYS and the Office of Product Safety and Standards produced a searchable spreadsheet that shows all the GB designated standards. So it's a really, really useful tool. It's available on the government website, open to everyone to look at, but it's really, really useful because it is searchable. And so if you are currently using an EU harmonized standard, and let's, for example, say that it's EN ISO 12100-2010, which that's what's called a type A standard that talks about how to do risk assessment and guarding and hazards, and you will be using that standard if you make machinery. You can type that in to this spreadsheet and it'll tell you whether it is a GB designated standard. And so, as Ben said, all EU harmonized standards are GB designated standards, but I think it's worth checking this list just to make sure that the standard you're using has been made a GB designated standard. So very, very useful tool that BAYS have produced that we can use to just answer that question and move on quite quickly. So, and again, you know, if it is a GB recognized designated standard, there's very little you have to change. Okay, so that's designated standards. So I'm going to now take you through almost my last slide, which is hopefully bringing all this together in a very clear flowchart again. But again, what is helpful for me to know is, are you supplying, so if you are a supplier of machinery, 36% of people said they were, are you supplying just into GB, GB and NI, GB, NI and EU, or just EU? So if you could answer that, we'll just pause for a couple of minutes to allow you to do that. And then we'll see where we go from there. How are we doing, Aaron?
That's perfect. Let me end the poll and I'll be able to share the results. Apologies, I didn't do that for the previous one.
Okay, no worries, no worries.
End poll and then we can share the results.
Okay. Great. So that's a very easy trend to analyze there, isn't it? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So 87% of people supplying into all three areas, which at the end of the day, I suppose is not surprising. All right, fantastic. So that really enables me to give the emphasis in the right point here. So so this next flowchart you can see, and I'm just going to zoom in here, it is absolutely designed to just answer some questions that you will have and show you the right way to go. And again, I know I've said this about 3 times, but this is specific to machinery. You can't apply the logic here to all products that you make. This is just about machinery. Okay, so first question, is your product machinery or not? So I talked about the definition of that. If it isn't, and that's sort of the point I'm making just there, if it isn't, you need to look at the regulation that regulates your products. So whether it's the, PPE directive and regulations, or whether it's to do with low voltage electrical equipment, only if it's machinery should you then use this flowchart. Okay, so if it's machinery, okay, we come down here. Am I supplying into the EU or NI only? Well, we know from our analysis that's not the case for many people, but good news if you are, because if you're supplying into the EU and NI only, then you don't need to change. Well, not true to say that you don't need to change anything, but you don't need to change much. So if you're supplying into the EU, it's the same as before. Use CE mark in line with the directive over here. If you're supplying into NI, again, possibly nothing changes. Depends if the body you're using to help you search is EU recognised or not. And that's when that UK NI mark comes into place. But most of the great majority of the time, perhaps you don't need to do very much here. So the old rules apply. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. So if I'm supplying into maybe all 3 areas, any combination that includes the GB, I have a question to ask myself. So first of all, do I use method 1? So remember on that chart before, what you might call self-certification. That's that's not what it calls it in the regulations, but method 1 is I certify myself that my products are safe, basically. So if I'm using method 1, then I can absolutely continue to CE mark until the end of this year. I'll say that again because it's very important. If I'm using method 1, I can continue to CE mark until the end of this year. If I'm not using method 1, so therefore obviously method 2 or 3, I need to think about the body that I'm using. If it is a an EU recognised body, or if I've transferred to an EU recognised body, if I did that before January 2021, if I've done that, then I can still continue to mark up until the end of this year. So if I'm using either method 2 or 3 and I haven't transferred to an EU recognised body already, I can't do it now. If I haven't already done that, then I'm over here. And again, with machinery, I must use the UKCA mark from the 1st of January for supply into GB only. So if I know that's what I've got to do, my next question is here. So step 1, are the standards I'm using for conformity assessment recognised in GB? So the spreadsheet that I just showed you, there's a link to it there. We can make these slides available afterwards if you want them. Click on that link, it takes you straight to that spreadsheet. So if the standards are the same, then I go up here, continue as before, but I use a UKCA mark rather than a CE mark. So the process, as Ben outlined, it is meant to be as straightforward and as painless as possible. So if I'm using GB recognised standards, I just carry on up here, sort of, what it was like before, basically, but instead of putting a CE mark, it's now UKCA. If my standards aren't, and they are supposed to be, and I'm sure they are, But for some reason, let's say things change in the future and the standards aren't the same. The answer's no. Then I need to find a standard that is recognised in GB that I can use. So I would, this is really a future one, I would need to find a different standard that is recognised in GB that basically delivers what the other standard used to do before. So I can use that, and then I can go up to step 2. In other words, there is no situation where I can use a standard that is recognised in the EU but isn't recognised in GB. I can't do that. I can't use that to UKCA mark. They're the same at the minute, but if there is divergence later on, that's when that might come into play. So that, hopefully, I know there's lots of information there, we'll make it available afterwards, but hopefully takes you through a simplified process of what you actually have to do. Okay, last thing I want to say before we go into questions is appreciate that you might have, and we're going to do some questions now, but appreciate you might have maybe quite detailed questions specifically about machining, machinery and UKCA marking. Then there's an email address there for you to get in touch with us. Any question, we'll answer it as quickly as we can for you. We do also do things like consultancy services where we can speak to you in more detail if that's required. And if you want to upskill the rest of your staff on these changes and what they all mean, we do a half-day awareness program to help you bring everyone else in your company, or not everyone else, but whoever needs to know up to speed. Okay, so thank you very much. That brings to a close what I've got to say. I'll pass back to Hilary.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was really helpful. We have got a few questions. So I'm just going on to them now. This is a company that self-declare building products and currently sell within the EU with CE marking. Our fire testing has to be done via a third party. Will GB fire test results be allowed for CE marking next year, or will they need to use an EU lab?
That's a very specific question. Did you say it was about construction materials or
building products?
Okay, so the best thing, sorry, this is again, this is a sort of a non-answer, but if you refer to the Construction Products Directive, that will give you specifically the answer to that question. So the Construction Products Directive rather than the Machinery Directive.
Okay, are you able to we can get a link for that and pop it across to the question afterwards?
Yeah, no problem.
We'll do it after in the follow-up pack. So I'll just take a
cool.
If you ask the question. Aaron, can you ask next one?
Question. We supply machinery as designated under Annex 4. We do not currently affix the CE mark to our product directly. It is on the paperwork. Will we need to affix the UKCA mark to the product from January 2023?
Yes. Yeah. Unless the only reason why you might not do that is because if it was so small that you couldn't do it. So the mark itself has designated proportions. If you can't fit that on, then you don't have to do it. But otherwise, you should be. It talks about indelibly affixing to the product. Yes.
Thank you.
Next question. Can I just make one declaration of conformity for CE and UKCA?
Yes. So your certificate, declaration of conformity, absolutely can be the same for UKCA and CE. No problem at all. The only question is, are all the harmonised standards and GB recognised standards exactly the same? If they are, that's a fantastic idea. Save yourself a lot of time.
Super. Thank you for that.
Next question. What if, would you have to CE certify a whole production line or series of machines all working together? Okay,
so that's a really interesting question, and one that we get all the time, whether prior to UKCA or not. The answer to that is that it's I'm going to say it's up to you, okay, but it's got to be proportionate to the risk. So what most organizations do is take that production line and break it into nominal, and it's up to them how they do this, but break it into nominal sections. and CE mark each area. And all you're doing when you're CE marking there, without knowing the whole details of the production line, you're looking at the technical files of all the different machines that you fitted together and basically bringing them all together, risk assessing to see if there are any new hazards, and then you CE mark that part. But the simple answer to the question is break it into sensible chunks and CE mark each one, or UKCA mark each one. Same answer as before, really.
That's perfect. Thanks, Chris.
Next question, where do I get standards from?
Well, okay, that's you won't like the answer to this question. So you get them from organisations like, well, not organisations like, you get them from BSI, British Standards Institute. They often are expensive. You know, so you're talking about, I don't know, an average price, but you're talking hundreds of pounds for a standard. So what a lot of organisations do is they subscribe to a service where you pay an annual fee and then you can pull down the standards as you require them. But start with BSI and go from there, I would say.
Lovely, thank you.
Next question. This is more around the definition of machines. Would an instrumentation box, a steel enclosure containing electrical terminal connection blocks, but with no moving parts, class as machinery? Okay,
no, that's a very simple answer, which is good. So no, if it's not got moving parts, then it's not machinery. There will be another directive it applies to, but it's not machinery.
That's perfect, thank you.
If supplying machinery to the EU and GB, is it acceptable to reference EU GB standards in the technical file?
Sorry, Hilary, say that again.
If you're supplying machinery to the EU and to GB, is it acceptable to reference EU and GB standards in the technical file?
Yeah, so absolutely, and that would be the best thing to do. You just need to check whether they are one and the same. So as long as they're relevant in both, in other words, they're GB recognised standards, the answer is yes. Because you've called it, you know, BS, EN, ISO something, doesn't matter. You know, you don't have to change it and take the BS off the end.
Okay, lovely. Aaron, next question.
Perfect. What if we make machinery equipment, but it's only for our own use?
Oh, great question. Yes, and again, probably won't like the answer to this one. So when Ben gave his presentation, he talked about placing on the market. Okay, now that sounds like you're selling something. Unfortunately, in the machinery directive, it doesn't just mean that. So if you're making something that is defined as a machine, if you're making it completely for your own use, then you still need to go through the UKCA marking process, or CE, you know, depending on where you are. But you definitely still need to UKCA mark that if it is machinery, even if it's for your own use.
That's perfect, thank you.
Lovely. I think we've actually come to the end of the questions on this session. So thank you very, very much to Chris. I think it just leaves me now to thank both of our presenters today. And we hope you find the session helpful. Again, thank you, Chris, for that. Finally, we'd like to let you know about next week's Roadshow, which will cover freight and logistics in the post-transition world. It will take place next Thursday at noon until 1:30 again, and Aaron's putting the joining link in the chat now, so we look forward to seeing you there if you can make it. Thank you again, everybody, for attending today, and goodbye.